All right, so we are live, everyone. My name is Jesse, and I am with Exploring by the Seat of Your Pants. For those joining us for the first time, we are all about bringing conservation, adventure, and science into classrooms around the world. And of course, there are no classrooms right now. All of you are stuck at home, so we really appreciate you tuning in on YouTube as we continue to highlight scientists, educators, explorers, and amazing facilities from across the globe. In April alone, we'll be doing over 100 live, free, no registration required programs. So we hope you continue to tune in and join us. Today, we are joined with a long-standing partner of Exploring by the Seat of Your Pants. Rachel Giles is joining us from Toronto, and she is an aquatic ecology and pollution researcher at the University of Toronto, interested in how cities and the pollution that they create affect wildlife in streams and rivers and other water bodies. So without further ado on this very, very topical presentation, I'm going to turn it over to Rachel. Thanks so much for joining us today, and take it away.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for having me today. Like Jesse said, I've done a couple presentations like this before, and it's obviously different since I don't have the classrooms with me today, but instead of about 4 classrooms, I probably have hundreds of them all throughout, hopefully Canada and maybe other places in the world. So if you are here, feel free to send us a little shout out of where you are in the world, just so we have an idea of who's listening. I'm going to take a second to just share my screen with you so you can see our PowerPoint. I have included subtitles at the bottom, so hopefully that is helpful for you and you can read them if you're not able to hear. I think my internet connection is okay. But today we're going to be talking about pollution in city rivers, and we're going to be talking about what kinds of pollution we can find and how we can use aquatic critters to tell us about how healthy or unhealthy a river is. Now, as Jesse said, my name's Rachel, my last name's Giles, and I study at the University of Toronto. I'm going to bring in my laser pointer. There we go. So before I get into telling you a little bit about my research, I thought I would tell you a little bit about myself. I study at the University of Toronto, and I've always been interested in aquatic ecosystems. So that can be anything from lakes to streams and rivers, and more recently, I've started studying oceans as well. And aquatic ecosystems are really cool. There's a number of different animals or organisms that we can find in them. And so I've been lucky enough to study fish, as well as smaller things like aquatic invertebrates, which I'll be talking about today, as well as these little things here. I don't know if you can see these little things here. They're called zooplankton. They're kind of like the flies of aquatic ecosystems. I've also been lucky enough to study some plants on terrestrial systems like ferns during my undergrad. And when I'm not doing research, I'm probably still outside. So I really like camping, hiking, biking, swimming, spending time outdoors. I've got a big family, and I live and spend lots of time with my twin sister, who you can see here. And if I'm not here in Toronto, I'm probably gallivanting some other place in the world. Not now, but this is a picture of me hiking in the Peruvian Andes, or the mountains. Now, we will have a question period at the end of today, but I would encourage you to get in touch with me if there are any questions that I leave unanswered. I have my Twitter handle here as well as my email. And I'm also part of an outreach team called the U of T Trash Team. We work on delivering and developing a number of outreach activities, lessons for kids in school, and we're also working on a lot of virtual activities as well. So if you're interested, I would encourage you to follow us or check out our website as well, because we'll have lots of fun things coming out the door in the coming days and weeks. Okay, so again, before we get into the research, I want you to just take a second to think about what you think of when you think of science. What does a scientist look like to you? What kind of work do they do? Where do they work? If you are sitting with your brother or sister, feel free to turn over to them and brainstorm a couple words, or if you have a piece of paper, just write them down. I'll give you about 15 seconds to brainstorm what you think of when you think of a scientist.
Fantastic. While you guys are thinking too, I just wanted to highlight that I've put Rachel's or the U of T Trash Team Twitter account on our YouTube chat bar, as well as the website, so you guys can check those resources out later as well.
Thanks, Jesse. Alrighty. So Hopefully, some of the things that you thought of were things that I thought of when I was a kid. And when I thought of a scientist as a kid, I thought of the sort of quintessential mad scientist, some person in a white coat in a dark basement with no windows, working at all hours of the day, using these test tubes, fancy chemicals, and fancy equipment that you don't really recognize. And while that is still science, and some of the science that I do now looks like that, a lot of the science that I do looks more like this. So instead of working inside with my white coat, I get to work outside, sometimes still in a white coat, but work outside studying the world around me. And so, if you are someone like me who loves working in the outdoors, then maybe this kind of science is a type of science for you. The type of questions that I get to ask are things like, why is this animal living here and not there? Or what happens to this animal when it becomes stressed out? What happens to this animal when another animal who doesn't belong there comes and lives there? And so I find it really exciting to be able to get to ask questions about the world that I live in. More specifically, I would call myself an ecotoxicologist. Now, that is a bit of a mouthful, and so I'm going to break it down so that you too can understand what an ecotoxicologist is. The first part is eco, which comes from the word ecology, which means the study of living things. And so as an ecotoxicologist, I study living things, not so much humans, more everything other than humans. Toxic is probably a word that's familiar to many of you. And a toxic thing is something that is harmful or bad to the things living within or around it. And ologist comes from the word ology, which means the study of. So, as an ecotoxicologist, I study how toxic things affect living things. And in this case, we're talking about aquatic critters or aquatic invertebrates. So, as an ecotoxicologist, I'm interested in how pollution, specifically pollution in cities, affects rivers. Now, when you think about different types of pollution, some of these images might come to mind. So, we have smokestacks that you might be burning coal or other substances. We have pesticides or fertilizers or herbicides in our farmland. And one of the things that we study a lot of in our lab is plastic pollution in cities or outside of cities, both the big stuff that you see here and the small stuff, which we call microplastics. And so there are lots of different types of pollution that we can find in rivers, and I'm going to be talking about just one of them today. So the questions that we're going to be exploring today are, what kinds of pollution come from cities? And we're going to be talking about one in particular. Where does that pollution go? So where does it end up? And then what can we learn from aquatic critters about pollution in city rivers? Now, you might be wondering, what are these aquatic critters? I have no idea what you're talking about. And here's a couple pictures of the aquatic critters that I'm going to be talking about. They're called aquatic invertebrates, and they live at the bottom of the stream. And although they might not be as beautiful as a fish or as a bear, we can actually learn a lot about them, and they are really, really cool to look at and to study as well. Okay, so our first question, what kinds of pollution comes from cities? Now, I mentioned earlier, there's lots of different types of pollution. I'm going to be focusing on just one today. And if you look at these photos, you can see that all of them have one thing in common, and that's roads. And if you've been in Toronto, you know that we have highways, much like this one here. And then we've also got city roads, much like the ones on the right here with the streetcars. And when we're driving or we're taking the bus on our roads, we are creating types of pollution that ends up on the roads and on the land close to the roads. So the types of pollution that we find on roads there are pictures of them here. Over here, we have salt. So if you live in Southern Ontario, you know that in the winter when we have lots of snow or ice, we often put salt on our roads or sidewalks to prevent us from slipping when we're walking or when we're driving. Unfortunately, most people tend to use a lot more salt than we need to. And so we end up having an excess of salt, which can be harmful to fish and these aquatic critters that we'll be talking about later today. Now over here on the far right, you can see a car tire. Most of the things that we use, most of the vehicles that we drive in to get to work or school have tires, and they're made of synthetic rubber, which is a type of plastic. And when these tires rub against the road, they create these tiny, tiny bits of rubber or microplastics that in our lab we call tire dust. And now we know that we see a lot of these little bits of tire dust in and around cities, and we're also seeing them in the rivers that I study as well. Now, of course, cars are made of metal, and as they age and get older, they'll release different metals onto the roads as well. And most of our cars are powered by gasoline, which will sometimes leak into the environment, and the exhaust fumes coming from our exhaust pipes will also be released as sort of like a dust on the roads. And so what we end up with is all of these 4 types of pollution sort of resting on the road. And again, these are our 4 different types of pollution: salt, metals, the chemicals from gasoline, and tire dust or microplastics. Now, where does this pollution go? It's obviously on land, on these roads. If you look at this picture of a city or this schematic diagram of a city, you can see that rivers are really intertwined with our urban environment. And in fact, if you visited Toronto or you live here, you'll see that we've got Lake Ontario right in our downtown. It's a beautiful big lake. We have people canoeing on it. We have the Toronto Islands. And the other thing that we also have in Toronto, if you kind of zoom out away from Lake Ontario, is all of these rivers. So the downtown area is just down around here where the red meets the green. And as we move up in this direction, we're moving out of Toronto and into sort of the suburbs and other cities and towns surrounding Toronto. So up here, we might have Brampton. Over here, we might have Scarborough. Over here, we have Mississauga. And each colored shape here represents a different river whose water drains into Lake Ontario. So not only do we have Lake Ontario, but we've also got all of these rivers that are actually within our city that become sort of like the capturing grounds for the pollution that's coming off of the roads. So the pollution comes off of the roads into these streams or rivers and eventually will make their way to Lake Ontario. And when we look at specifically the types of pollution that come from roads, I collected samples in these different places. So the orange, the green, and the blue. And you can see the orange is a little bit more inside the city of Toronto. In the green, we're closer to the city of Brampton. And then this blue, we're out more into we're actually in a conservation area here. And what we know is that in the city, we have more roads, and out of the city, we have fewer roads. And therefore, we have more pollution in the city, and we have less pollution outside of the city. And we're seeing these trends for both the microplastics, the pieces of tire dust, as well as the salt. I don't yet have my results for our metals and our chemicals from the gasoline, but my suspicion is that we'll see the same trends. I should mention, however, that I'm still in the process of collecting this data, and so it's possible that these results will change. Unlikely, but still possible. Science is really a process. So we know that there's this pollution, it goes onto the roads, it gets flushed off of the roads and into the rivers, and now we want to know what's happening to the rivers. How healthy are they? We know that the pollution's there, but is it having an effect on the things that are living there? And so I wanted to know what these aquatic critters can tell us about pollution in city rivers. Now, the first question is, what are aquatic critters? Okay, so if you're not familiar, aquatic invertebrates are these really interesting creatures. They can also be called benthic macroinvertebrates. And what I have here is a picture of like an ocean food web. And so the ocean food web is a little bit different to the freshwater food web, but this might be more familiar to you. In our freshwater food web, it's almost the same, except we don't have things like seals, whales, jellyfish, or squids. But we still have fish, we still have birds, we still have turtles. We've got phytoplankton, which are things like algae, zooplankton, those little flies of the aquatic systems. We still have plants. And then way down here at the bottom, we have our benthic invertebrates. So benthic refers to benthos, which basically just means the bottom of the stream. So the benthic invertebrates will live either attached to rocks at the bottom of the stream, or they're actually kind of burrow themselves into the mud about 5 or 10 centimeters down. And these can be anything that don't have a backbone. And so here are a few pictures of the invertebrates that I see in the river that I study, the Humber River. They can be anything from crayfish down here. This is a picture of an actual crayfish I found. Freshwater mussels. We have aquatic worms, snails. And if you didn't know this, a lot of flying insects, mosquitoes, black flies, dragonflies, a lot of them have a sub-adult phase, or like a teenager or child phase where they are aquatic. And so when they're young, they live in the water. And so we've got a really wide variety of different sorts of aquatic invertebrates that live in the bottoms of these streams that can then tell us about how healthy or unhealthy a stream may be. So how do we collect aquatic invertebrates? And this, I will tell you, is my favorite part of doing science, is actually getting to go outside to collect samples. So first we take our fancy field van, we gear up with our waders and our rubber boots and our backpacks. We go down by the stream, and I was sampling in the river, but you can sample in the summer as well. We plop down this big chunk of equipment called a Hess sampler. It kind of looks like a soup pot, but with the bottom cut out and then a net behind it. And so you put that in the mud, and then because the invertebrates live in the mud or attached to the rocks, you kind of stir up all the mud inside this sampler, and you brush off all the rocks so that any of the invertebrates that might be in there get lifted up and removed, and then they rush into the net. Then you take all of this stuff into the net, put it all to the bottom of the net, and put it into a container and take it home to the lab. Once we're in the lab, we can use our microscopes to look at these bugs under the microscope and figure out what species they are. And depending on the species, we can tell if something is more sensitive to pollution or more tolerant to pollution. So if something is a sensitive species, it won't survive very well in polluted waters. If something's a tolerant species, it will survive reasonably well in polluted waters. Okay, so now we've collected our invertebrates. What can they tell us about pollution? We want to know specifically about the pollution from roads and how we can use these aquatic invertebrates to tell us about how healthy the stream is. So aquatic invertebrates are bioindicators, which means that they can tell us about how healthy the ecosystem is. So in a healthy ecosystem, we'd have lots of different types or species of aquatic invertebrates. We'd have the worms, we'd have the larval phases of those flying insects, we'd have beetles, we'd have mussels, we'd have crayfish, a whole bunch of different kinds, lots of diversity in these aquatic invertebrates. We'd have both the sensitive species and the tolerant species. And in an unhealthy ecosystem, all of those sensitive species won't be able to survive. And so what we end up with is a lot lower diversity, where we're only seeing the tolerant species living in these streams. So not only do we see fewer species, oftentimes we'll see fewer bugs in general, compared to the healthy system that we see lots of invertebrates and lots of different invertebrates as well. So healthy system, high diversity; unhealthy system, low diversity. So if we're thinking about our example of road runoff, if we're in a healthy ecosystem where we don't have lots of this pollution, we'll see lots of diversity and lots of invertebrates. And if we go to a system like in the city of Toronto, where we have lots of these types of pollution, high levels of them, we'll probably only see a few of those species, and those are the species that are tolerant and able to survive with high levels of pollution. And we'll probably really only see those species. And so by looking at what species of invertebrates we find, as well as how many of them, they can tell us about how healthy that particular stream is in that particular location. Now, I'm sure a lot of you are thinking, oh no, there's so much pollution. What do we do? What's going to happen if we lose these invertebrates? Now I'm at home. I can't even tell my teacher about this. We can't even do anything at school. But the good news is there's lots of things that you can do at home, in your own household, in your own backyard, that you can do to help reduce pollution in your town and city. And this goes for pollution from roads, but also just more broadly, pollution that tends to be more popular or more abundant in cities than in more natural areas. So the first thing that you can do is share what you know with others. Hopefully you've learned some new things today. You can tell your parents, you can tell your friends on your next virtual call that you learned about aquatic invertebrates and how they can be used to tell us about how healthy a stream is. You can tell them that you learned about tire dust, these tiny microplastics that come from tires and wheels of cars and buses. When we do go back to work and school, you can try to carpool or walk or bike to school to limit the amount of wheels that we need to have on the road and to reduce the amount of tiny tire dust microplastics that are ending up on the roads. Today, now, while you're at home, you could write a letter to your local government about what you learned today. Tell them that you think it's important that we reduce things like salt, like the number of cars on the road, and that we try and make an effort to clean up our environments when we can. You can also, when the winter comes back, I know we're going into our summer, which is really exciting. But when the winter comes back, you can do your best to encourage your own household, your neighbors, and your school to reduce the salt, whether that means using proper snow tires, wearing proper footwear, or simply shoveling the snow before you put any salt or gravel down. You'd be surprised at how effective just shoveling can do if you shovel it right away. And lastly, to try and help reduce the amount of litter, especially plastic litter, you can reduce litter in your household. So that might mean reducing the use of things that create a lot of litter, reusing it, repurposing it, recycling, or even reducing your food waste as well, which has less to do with plastic waste. But I will mention a lot of the things that I'm talking about as things that you can do are going to be activities or related to things that the U of T trash team is going to be doing in the coming weeks. So if you're interested in staying in touch with us and taking part in more activities related to waste literacy, plastic pollution, reducing your own footprint, I would really encourage you to follow the U of T trash team or check out our website to see our list of upcoming events and activities, because we're going to be, like I said, rolling out a lot of those in the coming weeks. All right, so with that, I want to thank any and all of you who are here today. Hopefully I've convinced you that aquatic invertebrates are really cool little bugs that are worth studying and can tell us a lot about how healthy a stream is. Hopefully you've learned a little bit more about the types of pollution that we can find in rivers, and you'll leave here today with a couple things in mind that you can do to make an impact in your own household. Thanks.
Fantastic. Rachel, what a great presentation. And the subtitles in the bottom were fantastic. I'm amazed that worked as well as it did. So thank you for highlighting that as part of it.
I'm so glad.
Yeah, it was the first time we've done it, and it worked very successfully. So we'll have to incorporate that in the future. For everyone tuning in at home, and we have people from across Ontario, Virginia, Vancouver Island, Peru, and Chile, and more. So thank you for joining in literally internationally. We really appreciate it. Type in questions in the chat bar. If you haven't identified yourself, let me know where you're joining from. And we look forward to taking as many questions as possible. So our first question from Ange from Vancouver Island is, does plastic come off your bike tire as well? Do we need to worry about that if we're cycling in parks?
Unfortunately, yes. So I will still say that bikes are a better commuting option than a car because we don't have things like gasoline. we're not using things like gasoline to power them, and it's good for you to ride your bike. But unfortunately, when it comes to tire dust, yes, bikes will shed tire wear particles, and that's simply because of friction. So when your tires are rubbing against the road, there's going to be friction and erosion there that creates these tiny bits of rubber. Yeah.
Oh, thank you, Rachel. All right, if someone's at home and they're really keen on seeing some of these amazing cool animals that we really don't think about in rivers, could they collect them? Should they collect them? How would they go about looking at them? How do we see this wildlife in our backyards?
Yes. So I do know that how much you can go outside is going to vary depending on where you are in the world right now. I will say that these aquatic invertebrates are everywhere. So if you have a stream or a creek at the back of your house, or you're going on a socially distanced walk by the river, it might be a bit harder by a lake. You just want to take safety into account. But basically, if you go into any body of water and you kick up some mud or you lift up a rock and you sort of brush it off, you will find invertebrates. What you find will vary depending on where you go, but it's really amazing to see all of the different diversity that you can find in your own backyard. So if you are lucky enough to have a ravine nearby or a creek in your backyard or on your walk, on your one day a walk, then yeah, I would encourage you to be safe, but check it out. It's really cool.
Amazing. If any of you happen to have a microscope in your school or at home as well, there's even more you can discover. It's really, really neat and an engaging opportunity. All right. Is anyone, so while you talked about social distancing and there's fewer planes going, there's fewer cars on the roads, is anyone, are you studying or is anyone studying how this is causing a decline in river pollution, or if it is at all?
It's so funny that you say that because I've been at home for, it's the end of my third week being at home now. And I live right on a busy street here in downtown Toronto. My apartment is just on the third floor above it. And there's no one on the streets. The only thing that's really on the road right now is the streetcar that passes by every few minutes, and even those are empty. And so my best guess would be that especially tire wear particles and the pollution associated with cars is probably a lot less now that most of us are staying home. And my mom did actually say, "Hey, Rach, you should go out to your sites and see what the pollution is." Unfortunately, I'm not able, or I don't have permission from my university to be doing that. But I imagine theoretically that there is a lot less pollution now.
Very cool. All right. I stress again for anyone tuning in on YouTube, type in questions in the chat bar. We're going to take many more over the next few minutes, so please check that out. Is there a particular pollutant that's the worst? You highlighted a few different kinds of things that can get into rivers. Is there anything that we should, I don't know, be particularly concerned about?
So that's hard to say because different types of pollution, even the ones that I mentioned here, will impact different species of invertebrates differently. So, for example, salt is a type of pollution it's an ion, so it's sodium chloride. And so that has different effects on organisms than something like tire dust, which is a physical particle. So the effects of salt will have more an effect on invertebrates that breathe through gills. So think of fish. So if an invertebrate has gills to breathe, it's going to be more affected by the salt than if it just sticks its head out of the air to breathe. And so even within just the invertebrates, some will be more affected by salt and some will be more affected by tire dust. When it comes to tire dust, invertebrates can be impacted then because they eat them, and it goes into their digestive tract and either blocks their digestive tract so they aren't able to eat, or they're just eating tire dust and not getting any nutrition. So that's another way that the invertebrates can be impacted by tire dust.
Yeah, very cool. All right. We've had a person ask, now we've got people wondering which mode of transportation they should take best. So if roller skates are better than a bike or a skateboard or anything, I don't know if you have any way to clarify that.
Yeah, I would say that I think that, and this is a personal opinion, I wouldn't say that this is backed by any particular research that I've studied, but just from observation, we know that so many of us, when we're driving to and from work or school or whatever it is, we drive in a large car on our own. And so And obviously, that's a necessity for many people. And so, if you need to drive to work, try and carpool. So then there's one car on the road instead of five cars on the road. If you're within walking or biking distance or rollerblading distance, I would encourage you to do that. When you're making changes to your lifestyle to try and be more conscious of the environment or something like road pollution, it's really about taking steps that are manageable and realistic for you. So if it's not realistic for you to bike to work, don't bike to work. If carpooling is realistic, then carpool. And the idea here, and we're seeing this now even with our current situation, is that collectively we can take small steps as individuals to make a big impact on the well-being of our environment or our health in this case.
Fantastic. All right, Monica, Eva, and Susan, all in Toronto, right where we are. They want to know, are there any good websites or identification keys that can help us identify wildlife we find in these rivers and creeks?
Yeah, there are so many. If you're looking specifically for invertebrates, there's a couple websites that I can think of off the top of my head. One is EcoSpark. So they're a nonprofit and they actually do a lot of outreach programs related to invertebrate identification. So some of the photos that I included in my presentation are from them. I would check them out. And a sort of training and governing body that does a lot of the benthic identification training. So it's something that I did is called the Ontario Benthic Biomonitoring Network. I haven't actually checked out their website to see if they have sort of publicly available keys, but I imagine they do. And one of the best ways to start learning about nature is to just buy one of those little books. So the same way you might have a bird book for identifying birds or mushrooms or plants, you can buy those for invertebrates as well. And they're usually quite easy to follow. One thing, if you want to study all of the different kinds of things you might find in your city or in your natural environment, is an app. It's called iNat or iNaturalist. So that's a really great tool. You could even use it while you're on your walks now. You download it to your phone, you turn on your location services, and if you see something, a plant, an animal, a bird, whatever it is, you take a photo of it, you put as much information as you can about what it looks like, where you found it, etc. And then you're connected to a network of experts all throughout the world who can then identify whatever it is that you found. So I did that. I was in New Brunswick. I saw a frog. I am not a herpetologist. Took a picture, and within 2 hours, that frog had been identified as a mink frog.
How cool is that? I also we've gotten a lot of people mentioning iNaturalist on our programs. So I want to stress, if you apply for a grant with National Geographic and you want to use some sort of cool software or an app, you have to explain why you wouldn't use iNaturalist because it's so good. It's sort of the gold standard in the field. So very, very cool. All right. Rachel, again, it flies by these 35 minutes, but we're near the end of our presentation. So before we wrap up, is there any last message you want to share about how people can get engaged with, river and watershed ecosystem, understanding their community, about how they can work on, preventing trash and pollutants from getting into the water system? Anything you want to share to wrap us up?
I would just say, take baby steps, something that's manageable for you, that's doable and inspiring for you. And I would also, as I said here, my contact information is here, as well as the information for the outreach team that I'm involved with. So if you enjoyed today's presentation and you want some more hands-on activities, I would really encourage you to get in touch either with me or them so you can start actually taking action towards improving our natural environment.
Amazing. Well, this slide's been up for a very long time. So for anyone tuning in at home, very few of our speakers ever actually share their personal email. So if you guys want to get in touch and learn more, Rachel, we'll see how it goes. But we really appreciate you joining us today. For everyone tuning in on YouTube, thank you so, so much. Check us out on YouTube. Check us out on Twitter. We'll be highlighting the UFT trash team in the next few minutes. And we hope you can join us for, again, over 100 programs in April alone, live, free, no registration required. Thank you so much, everyone, and have a wonderful rest of your day. Bye, everyone.
Thank you.